Thank you very much for this invitation to come and join this evening with the Manthan group here in Hyderabad. I'd heard a lot about it, and I'm absolutely delighted that you found it fit to invite me for your first in-person meeting after the COVID break that has taken all your meetings online, and I'm absolutely delighted to be here. Of course, you cannot come to the school and not remember Shanta Rameshwar Rao, Shantama for all of us. When you enter these premises, you always get the feeling that when you turn the corner, you will see her coming towards you, and you quickly think of what you would need to say to Shantatama. Shantatama had an exquisite, almost divine handwriting, and she had this practice of sort of coming and standing beside your desk and writing something in your notebook. And I always used to watch how beautifully she wrote. And for a while I thought it was not just her, but the exquisite silver Parker pen that she had. And to this day I am yet not resolved in my mind whether it is the human agency or the instrument that brings out perfection in life. And I think it's a combination of both. So Shantatama is someone who has shaped our lives. I've been asked to speak on this current crisis that is raging in Ukraine, the Russian military force that is there for the last 8 to 10 days, and the larger implications of this for India and the world community. So what I would do is set out the discussion a bit in 3 main questions. What is happening now? How did we get here? And what are the big trends that we can draw? And what is essentially a very early stage in the conflict? It's a very old conflict, but the present phase of the conflict, we are in the very early stage. We are 24th of February, we are probably in the 10th day of the war. And of course, on an ongoing war, to seek clarity in analysis, you're of course weighed down firstly by the human suffering, and that is ongoing, of civilians, of children, of women, and that should never be, that should always be in our minds. And also the well-being of our nationals, Indian students who've been caught up in the various war zones in Ukraine. Many of them have returned, but quite a few of them are there. And our thoughts and our best wishes are with the Indian students who presently are being evacuated, and the government is doing quite a bit to get our students back safely and securely, given all the complexities of the war situation. Prime Minister Modi spoke to President Putin, President Zelensky. There's a lot of international activity that is taking place to get our students back safely. So what is happening now is that we are in the 10th day of the war. Russia mobilized troops, say, around December. There have been a number of diplomatic engagement that took place between Russia, the United States, Russia and Ukraine, Russia and the EU, with France, with Germany, and the list is pretty long. And this conflict, I think, has basically proceeded along 2 tracks. One is the threat of use of force, and the other is negotiation. And the negotiation track, despite 10 days of war, has still continued. Just last evening, Russia and Ukraine have held their second round of talks, direct bilateral talks. The first was held about a couple of days ago. And this is all this while Russia is pushing forward with its military offensive in Ukraine. And the Russian military offensive is taking place basically along three tracks. There is one from the south in Crimea, one from the east, which is from Russia, they moved into Ukraine, and one from the north, from Belarus downwards towards Kyiv. And the current military situation is that the southern offensive has made some progress, limited progress, but some progress. But the two offensives in the north and the east have slowed down, and some military commentators have in fact used the word a stalemate, or the Russian forces getting bogged down. But I think it's just too early to say. We are just sort of the early stages of this problem. Parallelly, I think the current trend, I think, is characterized by the unwillingness or the inability of both sides to compromise. So there is no accommodation from either the Russian side or from the Ukrainian side. And military conflict is continuing. What is also very notable is that Ukrainian armed forces and Ukrainian civilians have put up considerable amount of resistance, and this is another factor that is playing out in the battlefield as we speak now. Going forward, I think there has to be some evolution in the military situation for either side to be willing to compromise on certain issues. As long as both sides have the same but opposite expectations that the war is proceeding in their favor, naturally the inclination to compromise would be to that extent limited. War, as we all know, is very messy business. No war has ever concluded along the lines that it started. The first casualty of war, of course, are the war plans that are set out by each of the militaries. And as they say, the second casualty of war is always the truth. So we hear a lot of reports that that come out in the media. This is not just a military war. This is also an information war, and that is but natural in an interconnected world where media and social media particularly is so prevalent and so widespread. Naturally, conflict will be conducted along all dimensions where it is possible. But briefly, let me summarize the two sides of the argument, so to speak. As I have said elsewhere, an explanation is not a justification. But I think it's important to understand how the Ukrainians and the Russians, the two main protagonists to this conflict, see this conflict. From the Russian point of view, this has had some very deep roots, going back to the breakup of the Soviet Union in 1991. And for about 20 years, the relations between Russia and Ukraine were not exactly friendly, but basically non-conflictual. They had a number of differences, but these differences were never elevated to the level of open conflict. The differences arose largely on account of the fact that Ukraine is a very divided country, has been a very divided country, with eastern Ukraine with very strong connections with Russia, and western Ukraine having a more pro-European, pro-Central Europe orientation. So to impose a very specific foreign policy orientation on a divided country has always been a very divisive issue in Ukraine. And this came to the fore in 2014 when Ukraine sought EU membership, an accession agreement preparatory for EU membership, which was opposed by Russia. Russia made a counter offer. And in February 2014, which is I think a very important date in the chronology of this conflict, there was a forcible overthrow of the previous government, the then incumbent government, headed by President Yanukovych. President Yanukovych and President Zelensky are significant political factors in Ukraine. While previous presidents, and they have had several presidents since 1981, Yanukovych and Zelensky were elected with very vast majorities. Essentially, in a divided country, if you are elected with a very large majority, it means that different regions, different parts of the country have voted for a single objective or for a single agenda. And Yanukovych had a policy of engagement both with Russia and with the EU. And similarly, of course, it looks quite astonishing as we speak today, but President Zelensky was also elected with a very strong majority, and he defeated the previous incumbent, President Poroshenko, who had a very strong pro-European identity and was not interested in relations with Russia. But Zelensky was elected on a ticket of re-establishing peace with Russia. Of course, that is not to be, largely on account of the fact that the Minsk agreement that was signed in 2015 was largely left as a dead letter. The Minsk agreement provided basically for two main points: internal autonomy for the two regions in eastern Ukraine, in return for a commitment, internationally protected borders for internationally recognized and protected borders for Ukraine. So maintaining the territorial integrity of Ukraine, but giving autonomy to the two eastern regions, Donetsk and Luhansk. The civil war in Ukraine continued. The Minsk agreement was unable to settle the problem. The Russian allegation, which has been debated, of course, but the Russian allegation is that Minsk agreement was, the Ukrainian government was never interested in implementing the Minsk agreement. They wanted to solve the reintegration of the two republics into Ukraine by force. And more importantly, Ukraine was encouraged in this hardline position by Europe and the United States. So you have a divided country, you have a specific foreign policy objective that increases the divisions, and you have external support and patronage which doesn't encourage compromise but encourages a hardline position. On a hardline position in Ukraine is of course reflected and in Russia, where increasingly over the period of last couple of years, even while I was there in Moscow, increasingly the Russian position became hardline, which is a recognition that Ukraine was no longer an independent country. It was an extension of European and American influence. Though Ukraine had not joined NATO, the Ukrainian forces were coming up to NATO levels in terms of training. So the military threat that was posed by Ukraine posed a threat to Russia. And therefore, if dialogue was not the way to settle this problem, it was necessary to take it forward to settle it unilaterally and militarily. There were several stages of engagement on this issue, but all of them failed. And as I said, neither side has shown accommodation. So you have a deadly mix, which is a territorial issue, a divided nation, a foreign policy that only increases your internal divisions. You have external support and patronage. You have an elevated threat perception by a neighboring country, and an intertwined people. Russians and Ukrainians are separate but intertwined people. They've lived in their own lands. They have very distinct histories, but also intertwined histories. So they have very common histories, and therefore you have this explosive mixture that we see in this unfolding tragedy as we see today. Let me draw 5 basic trends, and I'll probably conclude thereafter and then see where we can go in terms of a discussion. The first trend that we see play out today in Ukraine is that it is a war in Ukraine, but it is a conflict between Russia and the West. It is no longer a conflict confined to Ukraine. And I define it West broadly, not in a geographical sense, but in a political sense. You would have seen that even Japan and Australia, which are not European, but they are Western, have joined in the campaign of sanctions that have been imposed on Russia. Secondly, the second big trend that is coming out is that there are 2 sorts of wars being fought at the same time. One is the war that is being fought with more familiar instruments, which is what the Russians are using, which is the use of tanks, artillery, raw military force as we understand it. But the conflict has been pursued by non-military means as well, and it is no longer confined to Ukraine. It is, in fact, we are in the midst of a global conflict, and let me explain why. This asymmetric conflict that is taking place today in Ukraine is being fought, of course, through military means in Ukraine. But the counter pressure that is being exerted on Russia is a system of conflict that is global, that is asymmetric, and presently non-military. If it can escalate to military, I don't know, hopefully it doesn't. But the lethality and the persuasive, coercive pressure that is being brought to bear on Russia is, I think, no less significant than the military force that we expect from an alliance like NATO or the other big Western military powers. There has been a dramatic, quite a revolutionary use in the weaponization of finance. The sanction system that has been imposed is something that we've never seen before. The main Russian central bank its assets abroad have been frozen, and wherever they have been kept, and mostly these have been in Western institutions in New York or in London or in Brussels or in Zurich in Switzerland, they have been frozen. Russia has been cut off from the SWIFT system. Several banks have been cut off from the SWIFT system. The European airspace has been, European and American airspace has been completely shut off for Russian airlines. American companies, Western companies who've been based in Russia are pulling out, including from very long-term investments. It's not just retail stores that are pulling out, it is big energy companies which are pulling out in a very big way. So it has affected finance, it is affecting energy. Presently the energy window is still open in terms of sanctions on Russia, but that might come in the next stage. In transportation, in the entire cyber network. So here we are looking at not sanctions that we have normally understood them to be, which is sectoral or individual sanctions, which have been imposed on countries before and have been imposed on Russia as well. But these are sanctions which almost amount to strangulation of a full and a large country. This is something that we've never seen before. The effect that they might have, the consequences of punitive strangulation of a large country like Russia, I think are one of the unknowns of this very troubling trend in evolution of the conflict that we see now. The third new trend that we are witnessing today is that globalization promised interdependence, but interdependence comes with vulnerability. You could sense it in the past, but now it is in full display. And what globalization has said is that ownership is not control. You might have a bank account in New York, you own that money, but it is finally the prerogative of the United States or UK or Europe to decide when and how you can control what you own. So ownership is now completely split from control, and the West is now exercising this in full measure vis-a-vis Russia. And this is not just bank accounts, this is also, I mean, you realize how much of this interconnected world is actually controlled from a few points on the globe. Everybody is familiar with the SWIFT system. We are familiar with the payment system in the United States. Those are familiar examples. But let's take the example of airline bookings. The entire airline booking infrastructure in the world is through 3 or 4 companies. And as of today, 3 of those companies have cut out Russia. Russian Aeroflot, which had a majority of Boeing and Airbus aircraft, hired, say, from companies, say, in Ireland, are grounded completely. There is no airspace on the western side of Russia that Russian aircraft can enter. You can't book tickets for any external travel except 1 or 2 small windows that are left, because these 3 companies have cut you off. And this sort of mobilization, strangulation, is not just limited to normal discourses of international engagement. Russian musicians, people who play music, painters, artists who are in the West have been asked to leave. And similarly, they have been sort of removed from sporting agencies, from media organizations and things like that. Now, the point I'm trying to make is not to say whether this is right or wrong. I'm saying what is now on full display is that face of globalization which can be weaponized in certain parts of the world against your interests in very quick measure. The fourth point I would like to set out before you is that we see in Ukraine what is essentially a big power, which is in the case Russia, trying to wriggle out of what it perceives as a disadvantageous security situation. You may agree with it, we may disagree or agree with the justifications that Russia has provided. But the fact of the matter is Russia is trying to hit back, push back. But the pushback from the other side is very united, very strong, very potent, and very ferocious. And we are only in the beginning stages of this confrontation. So perhaps the questions to ask ourselves is that maybe we were too quick to draw the rather comforting conclusions about the growth of multipolarity. I think multipolarity is the trend in which the world is going. But I think in the Ukraine conflict, globalized, we are seeing a unipolar backlash. It is very powerful, very potent, and it will send signals of geopolitical power that will reverberate for quite some time. And it is not just vis-a-vis Russia. I think the part of the European unity that we see today is partly a change in European perceptions of the Russian threat, but also an American diktat on Europe that when the chips are down, it is American unipolar interests that will prevail. And it is quite significant that even major countries like France and Germany, Switzerland, the Scandinavian countries have fallen in line. So we would see in Europe the beginnings of a major remilitarization of Europe. 2% increase in defense will be considered peanuts. Most of the defense purchases will then be with respect to American strategy and American weapons. So while the trend of multipolarity, which I think is an objective trend, and the world has changed in the last 30 years, there is definitely a unipolar backlash, which also leads us to the next point, that those of us who were under the impression that multipolarity would emerge through dialogue and give and take and accommodation, I think that is a myth. Multipolarity will emerge when it emerges, largely through the agency of the use of military force, which should not come as a surprise, because that is traditionally how in history redistribution of power has happened. So the events in Ukraine also bring into question this 30-year window that emerged after 1991. Let us all for a moment recall that the Soviet disintegration was a peaceful one, and we took it for granted that such large redistribution of power in the world would be undertaken without a contest of arms. It appears now that the contest of arms was not avoided, it was merely postponed. And that contest of arms is now happening as we speak in Ukraine. Ukraine is also another example of very troubled peripheries for large continental states. Russia is, of course, the biggest of them. India too is a very large continental state. We too have troubled peripheries. We have unsettled borders. both with Pakistan and with China. So the number of unsettled borders and peripheries for large states on the Eurasian continent, if we put them all together and you add this combustible element of the conflict in Ukraine, you will have a very large bonfire of instability spreading throughout Eurasia. Of course, this will have huge implications for China and China's own militarized ambitions and assertive policies that it wishes to conduct and which is shown in the recent past. But it also brings a new meaning to this conflict, which is fundamental to geopolitics between continental powers and maritime powers. So you have maritime powers at the present instance which are not present in the Eurasian continent, they are present on the peripheries, but they themselves are protected by two large oceans and a preponderance of maritime power. United States and NATO navies put together are by far ahead than any other. So you have a clash of interests between established maritime powers and very troubled continental powers, and we see that happening as we speak. So, you know, when we discuss events of the 21st century, we always believe that history moves in a straight line. For most part, history is very zigzag. History itself is quite undetermined, probably confused at certain periods of time on how it wishes to proceed. So past is not read. In fact, the past is not past. Some of the issues that we are dealing with today are very much part of the present discourse. So what implications does it have for India? And I'll end on that note. Of course, in the more immediate context, the well-being of our nationals, our students in particular, is our foremost priority. There is this principle that has come up for considerable debate, and you would have seen the debate in our newspapers on whether India should stand on the side of principle, on the principle of the protection of sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. My answer is yes, I think we should. But the protection of principle should also be done in pragmatic ways. Principles don't look after themselves. It is pragmatic actions that create the space for principles to survive and prosper. And principles alone don't give you the protection that you desire. In this very troubled world, there are no certainties. The only certainties that we can see is that of constant change. Some of the myths that we thought underrode the very benign nature of globalization, I think those myths are disappearing like soft mist right in front of our eyes, which in a way itself is good, because when you have clarity in vision and clarity in the mind, that is the beginning of good policy. I would say we should maintain our own capacity for both judgment and action, take a view consistent solely with our own interests. And India is large enough and specific enough and strong enough to pursue its own path in support and cooperation with those who are willing to understand and respect our interests. Our bilateral relations with Russia, I was in Moscow as custodian of our relations for 3 years. I would say that it has a considerable amount of depth. It is anchored in history, in good sentiment, and a convergence of interests, and the convergence of interests will continue. I've given the example of a very troubled states on the Eurasian continent. But we will also need to recalibrate our relations with Russia in the context of the evolving struggle that is now coming into full play in the triangular relationship between Russia, the United States and China. I am quite confident that given the India's ability to think through for itself, we will find both the means and the wisdom to take India through these very, very troubled times. I thank Manthan for this opportunity, and I'll be very happy to answer questions.
For this very impressive overview of the conflict, the historical origins of the conflict, and also talking about what the future could bring and how we need to negotiate the future. I'm sure there will be many questions, but let me, as the owner of the mic, start with one. You made the point that throughout history, I don't know what phrase you use, but major issues have been settled by war. Two things here. One is, why was war necessary for Russia to settle its conflict or protect its interests? Second, what worries some of us is the difference from history is that for the first time the world has the capacity to annihilate each other, the whole world, many times over. So should states be rethinking war as an instrument to settle conflicts?
Starting with your second point, it's absolutely right. Wars are not just unwinnable, particularly nuclear wars, but invariably wars as a settlement of disputes, they are always messy. The United States of America, which is one of the most frequent resorters to use of force in international affairs, has not won a war for many, many decades. The Russian Federation decision to use force, of course, has been governed by a thinking that has grown in Moscow, and that all options for dialogue are being rejected by both Ukraine and their supporters in the West, and therefore there remained no space for settling these issues before the situation became even worse. Of course, this is a justification that can be debated, and there are very strong views against it. In circumstances of war, a lot gets justified if the war is quick and is successful in terms of political outcomes. But we have already crossed that phase. This is already the 10th day of the war, and an easy Russian military victory in Ukraine is now a thing of the past. So we now come into the next stage of the conflict, which is both a contest of arms and a contest of wills, and which side therefore then comes to the conclusion that it is better to negotiate an outcome that partially protects its interests and therefore find a way out. Presently, as I mentioned in my talk, there is an approach of no accommodation on both sides. That is largely an account of the fact that they believe that the military situation will evolve to their advantage. As long as that belief exists on both sides, I think the propensity or the inclination to compromise will be less. But I agree with the general thrust of your question, which is war as a means of settling disputes to your advantage has an extremely poor record. And I don't see how the ongoing conflict in Ukraine will be an exception to that very strong historic rule. It is not only inhumane in terms of the lethality of force that is used on many sides, the tragic loss of civilian life, children and women included, the displacement of families, the decimation of the middle class. You know, there's one point that we have to recall, that the middle class in Ukraine as in Russia emerged after 1991. As we speak today, the middle class in Ukraine is being either disrupted, destroyed, or forced into exile, or forced to flee their country. The economic sanctions that have been imposed on Russia is reducing the middle class that has grown up in the last 20-25 years into poverty and penury. So you have two major structures of middle class which have been the children of globalization, so to speak, of free democracies, of free markets, the right to travel anywhere in the world. I mean, if you were issued a visa card, I mean, you could use it in Ekaterinburg to New York to Hawaii to Santiago to Delhi. Today, you have a card issued by a Russian bank. You can use it nowhere except in Russia. So you can't travel in Aeroflot to any part of the world. But it's not Russia alone. You see, this notion that a country can choose its foreign policy line, irrespective of the consequences, carries its own risks. So Ukraine, theoretically, in terms of law, has the right to choose its external alliances. And that is the argument that has been made by a certain section in Ukraine and very strongly supported by the EU and the United States. But finally, the test of any policy is the success it provides in giving you security. So you have a 20-year campaign of Ukraine to join NATO. It started in 2002. And in 2022, your country is split, it's devastated. It may not provide any victorious outcome to Russia. But the fact is that you have chosen a policy that has not yielded the results that were originally envisaged. And similarly, I think it's a failure of Russian policy, which is that war always is by itself an admission that your other policy objectives, instruments have not worked. And the test of any policy is the policy that you exercise in your neighborhood. That is the test of any foreign policy for any country. And so for Russia, if it saw that it has exhausted all its means of settling what is by their own account a very substantial, a very deep security problem that they faced in Ukraine for a considerable period of time, if they have reached the stage where they have to resort to use to military force, that in a particular way is an admission that all other policy instruments have been a failure.
Good evening, sir. An excellent lecture, enjoyed by all of us. We're very grateful for that. I'm Venkatesh Varma. I introduced myself. I was an HVS2, 1970 batch. Just a few things came to my mind. After, I think it was Clinton, Bush, Clinton, then Obama, I think they all gave some assurance that NATO would not expand further. That was one of the basic reasons why Putin has been so afraid of, Ukraine joining NATO. And there seems to have been some sort of a accommodation between, even though the NATO expanded during those years, some sort of a not crossing the red line, perhaps. But did Biden encourage Zelensky to the point of no return. And did Zelensky lack the foresight not to take it too far, to take it, I mean, to enter into make Putin use force, which has destroyed Ukraine now. So, did Zelensky and Biden not read the threats of Putin correctly? That's one. Secondly, if whatever may be the outcome of this war, which might be decided maybe in a month or so, one way or the other, if diplomacy does not succeed in settling the issue, what will be the consequences? I know it will be devastating for India. Thank you, sir.
Well, three questions you asked.
Yes.
First is this successive phases of NATO expansion. There were 5 of them that happened. The question that you are hinting at is that was there some understanding, some accommodation when these 5 things happened? The Russians kept complaining right from the first expansion. They were not heard. Largely on account of the fact that it was considered in the West that Russia need not be heard, drawn from their own assessment that Russia was weak and therefore need not be heard. So they were not listened to. Russia now feels that it is strong enough to take forward that message, same message in a different way. Your second question relates to the consequences of this present conflict in Ukraine and the war continuing for a particular period of time. See, wars arise from calculation and miscalculation, and wars also proceed along quite unpredictable lines, and they have invariably unforeseen outcomes. The United States of America intervened in Iraq. They were in Iraq for 10 years. The unforeseen outcome of the American intervention in Iraq is that Iranian influence in Iraq has increased many times. That was not anticipated in 2003. The ongoing conflict in Ukraine similarly will have unforeseen and unpredictable consequences for Ukraine, for Russia, and for European security. You cannot have a major vicious war in the center of Europe and expect Europe to be unaffected. Refugees is one consequence. There will be other consequences as well. I gave you a detailed description of what the West can do. I didn't mention very much what Russia can do in return. Russia produces 30% of the world's wheat production. Russia and Ukraine. Both are in war zones now. Russia produces almost 20-25% of energy. Russia supplies 40% of Europe's energy needs. So Europe is restarting its coal plants, its nuclear reactors. They will buy American oil and gas and LNG from the United States at 2, 3, 4 times the price as was supplied from Russia. These are the economic costs of a geopolitical conflict. You get the same stuff, but at 3, 4 times the price. India will not be immune to this cascading negative effects that will come out from the Ukraine conflict, and I tried to explain in my talk that it's no longer it is merely a war in Ukraine, but it is a global conflict regarding Ukraine. Now, we have a very strong defense relationship. It will be our task to see how best it can be insulated. Some effect will be there, that's inevitable. We have huge investments in the energy sector in Russia, but we don't import directly, physically we don't import much from Russia. So in the energy sector, there's a huge shortage of fertilizers in the world, and Russia was considered to be one major supplier of fertilizers, and I was working on that when I was there in Moscow, and that becomes more problematic. We do about $10 billion worth of trade. Pharma is one, organic chemicals another, but physical trade will become more and more of a problem. Maersk has refused to take containers to Russia. So this is not sanctions as generally understood. This is sanctions leading almost to strangulation. And how countries react when they feel that they are being strangulated. We have some instances in history which are not reassuring and encouraging at all. So there is chance of miscalculation from both sides. But as I said, as this is early stages of the conflict, and I do hope that Sena councils will prevail, and an off-ramp, what the Americans call in their usage, both sides find a way of settling for objectives which are less than their defined objectives, accommodation. And presently neither side is showing accommodation. So we'll have to move from that stage to a stage where both sides think that some compromise is necessary. Yes, madam.
Hi there, I'm Praveen. Russians, even though they have, after 1990, they have done away with communism thing, they still celebrate the great, win in the Great Patriotic War. And President Putin has used the phrase denazification. Is he using that for galvanizing international opinion, or is it to whip up the Russian sentiment related to the Second World War? How would you see it? And also, Ukrainian nationalists like Stepan Bandera did have a tie-up with Nazis, and they had some common history. So, how do you see that angle, denazification? Thank you very much.
Well, the memory of the Great Patriotic War, the Second World War, what they refer to in Russia, is absolutely central to their historic memory, and rightly so, given the immensity of sacrifice that they made for the Allied victory in the war. And that's just not confined to Russia. It is also a very sacred memory in all the other ex-Soviet republics. The defense of Moscow in December 1941, when the German army was near the present-day Moscow airport, 10 kilometers from the Kremlin. The defense of Moscow was done by freshly arrived Central Asian troops. They were troops from Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, from Siberia. They came and defended Moscow. So the entire Soviet population paid a price for victory in the Second World War. There were pockets of collaboration with the Nazi Germany during the war. And the biggest pocket of collaboration was in Western Ukraine. And Western Ukraine had also very strong links with Poland. You yourself answered the question by referring to Bandera. Now, Bandera collaborated, the Germans lost, the Western Ukrainians fled along with the Germans. And when Germany itself was defeated, many of the Bandera supporters kept alive his memory as a memory for a nationalistic Ukraine. So while there are normal Ukrainians, ordinary Ukrainians supporting Ukrainian nationalism, which is only to be respected, there is also a small streak, and not a small streak, of Ukrainian nationalism that can be traced back to Bandera. And Bandera was not just collaboration with the Nazi Germany. Bandera fully accepted the Nazi ideology. I don't know whether it's on Netflix or on Prime Video. This video documentary on John Demjanjuk, this 90-year-old American who was caught in the U.S. For being a security guard in Treblinka in this concentration camp. Where did he come from? He came from Western Ukraine. He was a Ukrainian, and he was part of a group of Ukrainians who left Europe and migrated to the United States. There is a very strong Ukrainian diaspora in the United States, which is strongly supportive of Ukraine taking a very independent position, joining NATO and opposing Russia. Ukraine allows dual nationality, so you have a number of members of the Ukrainian government who are also American citizens. So, you can have certain political tendencies, but these tendencies can get a new life in circumstances which may not be there 10 years before or 20 years before. You asked the question whether Russia exaggerates this. I don't know, it's difficult to say, but in their mind, this is the central problem in Ukraine. Absolutely the central problem. Their belief, I don't know whether it can be acted upon in the near future. Their belief, if you take out the Nazi element from the Ukrainian polity, the rest of the Ukrainian people have no problem with living in peace with Russia and Russians living in peace with Ukraine. And so it is this element that has created, of course many of you would have seen this, there is a video that is now doing the rounds of a very distinguished professor from the United States, John Mersheimer, who says, I'm not saying it myself, I'm repeating his argument, that the United States connection with Ukraine made the Ukrainians more hardline in their negotiations with Russia. And that has brought us to this notion that there should be no accommodation. And unfortunately, there is no accommodation on either side now. Please, ma'am.
Thank you for your lecture. And I think it was opened our eyes. I have a slightly off-tangent question. You talked a lot about weaponization in the end of your lecture. And did Russia anticipate this kind of sanctions on it and the power of these sanctions? And also, did the NATO or the US, the European nexus, ever thought that they could use this kind of weaponization? And throwing a light a bit on weaponization in contemporary world, and how prepared is India for this?
Ma'am, the short answer is I don't think they expected this ferocity and the quick nature in which these sanctions have been imposed, because these are quite unprecedented. They never happened before. The closest historic analogy you can come to is the sanctions blockade that the United States had imposed on Japan in 1941. But this was not, this is a little more severe than what is there on Japan. And you recall what happened. Japan lashed out and it sort of attacked the United States in Pearl Harbor, and it led to the Japanese entry into the Second World War. The implications for India, I think we should wake up and smell the coffee and see what is happening in the world. And I said, you see, like us, middle class, we have a lot of Russian friends who also have Apple phones, right? We buy an Apple phone here, you buy an Apple phone, Russians buy Apple phones in Russia. So you buy that instrument, but then you realize, now the Russians are realizing you don't control that instrument. So they can cut you off from Google Pay, they can cut you off from the Apple Store, they can cut you off from the cloud, they can cut you off from almost anything. And I'm only giving you a small example of an Apple phone. There are so many other examples. And if you don't link your phone with your email will crash. If you don't link your email, then your bank account won't work. It's all an integrated infrastructure. So that's why I said it is a revealing moment for the world that the present conflict has shown that if you think ownership is control, you're sadly mistaken. Now, we knew this problem manifested itself in the terms of having servers for internet users and all. You remember there was this debate in India whether MasterCard should download Indian users of MasterCard in Indian servers simultaneously along with servers in the United States. So we have a record, they also have a record. MasterCard refused, and therefore there's no MasterCard in India. And that was a problem that, so there is a diagnosis of the problem that, you have this global infrastructure, it is widely used, and for most of the time it is invisible. I mean, do we remember every day that Apple is an American company? We don't. I mean, we think it's a global company. It belongs to everyone. But I think the Russians today are realizing that for political and geopolitical reasons, you can be reminded of where you stand and where you sit in this world very, very quickly. I mean, the Russians have been reminded in a matter of 2 weeks. Now the question is what? How do you protect yourself? Do you build infrastructure by yourself? But how do you cut you see, when you make any national sovereignty decision in a globalized world, there's always a pushback, because most of these technologies are, all over, because scale is very, very important. But then when you carve out a national thing, first of all, there's a lot of resistance from the global players, not just India. Look at the 4 or 5 big American companies, how they operate in Europe. And that domination will only increase. And why just the Americans? You look at how Japanese companies, Chinese companies have operated in a couple of markets where they dominate. So the instinct for domination through technology is very powerful. In the long term, the only solution to that is to have your own technology. But I think redundancy, having firewalls, creating your own carve-out spaces in emergencies, I think that's the way to move forward. But the fundamental lesson is that conflict is double-edged. You enter into a conflict to protect your interests, it is double-edged. Both sides pay a cost, which we are seeing today.
You have spoken about the sort of overwhelming nature of the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, but you haven't said anything about the overwhelming characteristics of the Russian army, which is also confronted with these. You see these images of 40-mile long corridors of Russian armored vehicles that are descending on Ukraine by Russian threats to eliminate Ukraine virtually as a country, and so on. That's one thing. The other thing which has come up with one other question you just answered about the Nazi element in Western Ukraine. A far more recent thing that Ukraine has suffered at the hands of Russia is during the Stalinization and collectivization. And the the effect that happened, massacre of the Cossacks and the ruin of their agriculture. So surely that is a genuine grievance. I mean, historical grievance that Ukraine has, and memory is lost along that.
Maybe you're right. On the Russian advance, this 40-mile assault that is taking place on Ukraine is brutal. I have throughout my talk said that it will not lead to good sustainable results. Whether it is slowing down by purpose or by design or by circumstance, we'll see. There is a debate on that, whether the Russians are bogged down or they're deliberately slowing down to whether they're short of supplies or oil or food or not. We don't know. I mean, this is, as I said, there's a real war on the ground. There's also an information war in which Russia is almost completely absent. They don't care what the world thinks of them, unfortunately so. On the Holodomor, ma'am, yes, you're right. There was a lot of millions died in Ukraine, and it is extremely tragic. One of the grave consequences of the rule of Stalin in the Soviet Union. But there were equal or even more number of people who died in Central Asia. So I think when we look at facts, we should also remember that recollection of history is also very cruel. That the weak, even their pain is never heard. Ukraine's pain is heard because they are more powerful and they have better friends in the West than. So you read about it, you ask me a question about Ukrainian losses in collectivization. It would not occur to you, and because you've not read it, of the other peoples in the Soviet Union who suffered more grievously. So historic recollection of grievance is very painful. It normally, you can hear it because the voices are slightly louder than many other voices which you will not hear. So, please.
My history, if you just remember this country, Israel, it faced the same kind of issues.
Into the mic.
What they are facing. And over the years, Israel has been able to hold its own for many years. Do you foresee any one of these countries able to hold their own for many years to come? Like Israel. Part A. Part B. North Korea has never been in the scene now. Imagine if they are into the scene, how will the world change? Scenario will change. Number one, Israel, and number two. Thank you.
So how the military situation plays out will determine the outcome of this. As I tried to repeat several times in my talk, presently both sides hold the same but opposite conclusion, estimation, and that they have the upper hand and therefore they don't have to compromise. The Russians think that they will win on the battlefield, the Ukrainians think that the Russians will get bogged down, so they do not compromise. So in the next couple of days, we'll see how the military situation will play out, unfortunately, with tragic consequences.
Compare with that country, Israel. How do you compare it?
You see, the Israeli comparison is always very popular, but always with the wrong conclusion. Israel also lost in Lebanon, you tend to forget. So military quagmires are ruthless in bringing down very powerful countries. Quagmires, stalemates. You go in, you don't have a political objective. You know, the United States went into Iraq, it was there for 10 years. You saw the political outcome. The United States was in Afghanistan for 20 years. You see what happened. If Russia remains in Ukraine for a long period of time, I don't see how Russia can come out of this this situation can be to Russia's advantage. Not at all. On the contrary. What was the second question?
Ukraine is still able to hold its own, even now, so many years. That part is not.
Okay, I will grant you that.
Number two, North Korea.
North Korea, it's very difficult to predict what the North Korean leaders thinks.
No, but if they are into the state, it will be a havoc, as I think.
You see, but the North Koreans have pushed for opportunity, but never to an extent where the whole world turns against them. The whole world is concentrating on Ukraine. So why will they turn their attention to themselves?
Exactly. In the next couple of years or next year, some people think that there is a possibility that China may attack Taiwan or India. What is the probability? If China attacks India, because we have to defend. Anyway, we will defend. But we have to pay enormous price. What is your view?
No, I agree with you. I mean, we should defend and we will defend and not play an enormous price. No, very high that the Russians, that the Chinese don't take India lightly. They know we have very strong military force. They know that our military deterrence has only increased over a period of time. So they will not treat us like any other country. So I don't think we should be we should draw conclusions that compare Ukraine situation to the India-China situation. On Taiwan, you see the situation between Taiwan and Ukraine, the difference is the following. In the case of Ukraine, the United States is not committed by treaty to defend Ukraine. It's not part of NATO. In the case of Taiwan, the United States has a treaty commitment to defend against Taiwan, against China if China attacks Taiwan. So that I think is a very major part of China's calculation, and I think American military power is very substantial. So I don't think, you see, Russian intervention in Ukraine was across a land border, and you see how difficult it is if there is no assurance of success. If Chinese intervention on Taiwan happens, it has to be across the sea, which is 10 times more difficult. And everybody is prepared and everybody is aware, and there's vigilance all around. So I would say that the Chinese will think twice before they go down that route.
The official demise of the UN. I mean, in this whole talk, such a comprehensive talk, there was no word about not only this evening, but the past couple of weeks, the articles that we've read, the people that we've heard. It doesn't seem to be anywhere on the scene. And would you agree with Sam Petruda when he says, it's time we redesign the world. It's time these institutions have just collapsed, whether it's World Bank or WTO or the UN. And especially because of some of the things that you mentioned, the technological things that have been happening, the developments in the last 30 years. This has completely changed the way we operate in this world. So, do we need a complete redoing?
We need a complete redoing, but the lesson that is coming out from the Ukraine crisis is that this redoing means a redistribution of power. So the lesson that is coming out from the Ukraine crisis, it's a reminder actually, it's not a new lesson, that big powers are very reluctant to do a redistribution of power through dialogue. They are status quoist. What is there they want to keep. They will give you a little bit. So India was not part of the international system. India was not even independent in 1945. We became independent in 1947. But so when the UN was created, India was just independent country, we were weak at that time. So we have been making the demand that India should be part of the Reformed Security Council. So this present Ukraine problem has shown the weakness of the UN, that is for sure. Unable to prevent conflict, it is unable to restrain Russia, and it is unable to protect the interests of Ukraine when it says that it has been attacked by a fellow UN country. Similarly, with respect to WTO, where these sanctions are against WTO things, Russia cannot appeal to the WTO because these are overridden by American legislation. So the fundamental point, which is absolutely right, which is behind what you've asked, is that the institutions of world governance are outdated, they need an overhaul, and they are not consistent with the power equations at the present structure. The diagnosis is very easy to come, which I am giving you. Now, but how do you proceed from the diagnosis to an actual redistribution of institutions, restructuring of institutions that will be consistent with the new world? Unfortunately, people don't act on reason. Countries don't act on reason. It's reasonable to say that we should have to have a Security Council which is more protective. It is reasonable to have a WTO which protects trade interests. But it is rarely agreed to by the big powers if it involves some reduction of their special privileges. They don't give it up. That is the problem.
Good evening, sir. There is a saying that you have been like USA, I am saying.
Keep your mic close.
Hold on. Sir, I am Hare Krishna. Good evening, sir. But there is a saying that you have been like USA, you no more need enemies. Because I am saying this because if the United States of America supported Ukraine first, and now they left Ukraine alone in the battle. Now the entire Western media is blaming Russia. Sir, is it the right time to rethink India foreign policy? We are engaging more with USA rather than Russia.
I think India should have open relations with all major powers. You know, the power distribution in the world is not something that you have chosen, but you need to have options in different places in different areas. What the United States can give you, no other country can give. What the Russians can give you, there are no easy alternatives. So why should you go one way or the other and keep your options open with both? And they want to keep options open with you. So why are you shutting the door if the other country wants to keep its options open with you, right? So in this very troubled world, you should keep as much option as possible, and I think that is what drives Indian foreign policy today.
Sir, many things, but only two things I learned. One, I recently read the lack of democracy and transparency led to the disintegration of USSR. Second thing is, can again India need to play a role like it did in the past, creation of non-aligned relation? This time, why not India create a kind of a thing where the power is redistributed towards some kind of equilibrium? Maybe in an area like, why not India join Russia, China and Japan and South Korea to make our own aircraft? And what are the lessons for India from this?
The good part of your question is that you are thinking imaginatively, which is, I think, a very good way of exploring possibilities. We should never close these possibilities. See, democracy is a system that generates good political legitimacy, right? Democracy also has a good system of self-correction. All countries make mistakes. The chances of a democratic country correcting its mistakes is slightly higher than other systems, right? So that we should keep in mind. But democracy itself will not, in this power-driven world, itself will not be an assurance of your guarantee of your security or your success. You need other things as well, but democracy definitely helps. Okay? So
I mean, I know the Telugu phrase, I hope I can translate it right. Whoever tills the land owns the land. I have the mic, so I have the right to determine that this is the last question.
So that is it?
Is China winning this war?
China is a growing power, an assertive power, but China has its own set of weaknesses. And China was reinterpreting multipolarity in its own interests, which is it wanted a multipolar world but a unipolar Asia. Now a unipolar Europe is returning, which is not necessarily good news for China. But Chinese are also realizing that this global interdependence, which is such a double-edged sword, if it affects Russia, it can also affect China. Russia-America trade is what, $20 billion. US-China trade is $750 billion. So there is interdependence on both sides. But you weaponize this interdependence, you will go down, but both of you will go down. There are fundamental issues of conflict between US and China, but there are also a number of stakes involved which want to pursue this through dialogue. So I don't think we have reached a stage where a conflict between China and the United States is imminent. But that doesn't mean that it is there is no guarantee it will not happen in the future.